Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Creatively Free. I'm your host, arielgrace, and today I have the delight of having Mallory Meyer, who is, well, she's got a lot going on in her title, so I'll let her explain a little bit about it. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know the title it can be a lot, right? And so I've kind of just distilled it down to ever so simply say I'm a leadership and neurocoach, also a fractional HR, but Reiki master. And there are certifications behind that, but I'll let the audience, if they're curious to learn more, tap into that. Ultimately, it does have to do with subconscious modalities. And very much, I feel the conversation that we're having today is speaking more to the energetic side of things, like with my Reiki background, and really kind of witnessing the path that really not just unfolded for me, but started to unlock within me in witnessing how my intuition was guiding me to the place that I'm at today.
Ooh, amazing. Yeah, let's just dive in and talk a little bit about your story.
Mhm.
So how has your intuition, like where did it start, I guess, and when did you start paying attention to your intuition?
Truthfully, I would say I started paying attention probably it was now 2016, 2017, and obviously we're recording this in 2024, so it was just a few years back at the sense of really starting to get into Reiki at that point in time, but then also recognizing I was so embedded in the culture environment in corporate that I was so strongly harnessed in that masculine energy. And by masculine, it was just simply like kind of running on autopilot, just kind of molding and shaping myself into expectations of others or even from my parents and who I thought I should be. And as I started to explore and see Reiki come into my life, just receiving it from masters and practitioners, I really just started to kind of feel this light within me, not just unfolding and expanding, but getting a better sense of what it really meant to slow down and what actually feminine energy meant. Because I was almost had this preconceived notion of the divine feminine being like ecstatic dance or really sensuality kind of like elements with the feminine. And it's there's nothing wrong with that, but in that essence of it, the divine feminine is also accessing your intuition and being creative and having that resource. So the pendulum for me was just so widely spread on the masculine side that in 2016, 2017, coming more into these healing modalities really allowed me to recognize, oh, this actually now makes a lot of sense as to like why I was either operating this way or just getting more affirmations externally, even as to like what my intuition was trying to tell me.
Right. So the voice had been there probably for a long time, but you had learned to, or the way, whatever way, we'll talk a little bit more about the way it shows up, but you
Yeah,
feel like you had a presence of it, but we're just kind of very shut off.
completely.
Right.
Masking it, just not even like engaging with it, which I think our intuition loves to be acknowledged in ways of just kind of letting it know, like, I see you, I feel you, I hear you, I
Yeah.
trust you, and I can lead with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for gender disclosure for a moment, I want to say that for those that aren't familiar with this terminology of masculine and feminine, it isn't really gender based. It's not meant to be gender,
Mhm.
and it really is around, at least the way that I've learned about it as well and kind of absorbed my own teachings. You might have heard yin yang, like different competing energies that kind of run the universe, and one
Mhm.
part of it in a beautiful paradoxical way, right? And they work together. And you may have
Yes.
masculine being more around structure and like directionality and focus and things like that, and then the feminine being sort of like what Mallory was just saying, like inspiration and like consciousness, essentially, like what wants to
Mhm.
move through and create and all kind of the formless, really. um,
Completely. Yeah, and I've also loved like yin and yang, and then I used to bring in more because of like the gender titling with it too, of like sun and moon energy as
yeah.
well. So to each their own, whatever lands the best, but it is like you just beautifully said, like holding these two kind of paradoxes and letting them both have some equilibrium in a better way and finding
Right.
that. Mhm.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I've certainly been on a journey of that, similar as well, of kind of rebalancing out of one dominant, which I think is the invitation, essentially, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think in different seasons and cycles of our life, it might demand more sometimes for us to be in that. Just like almost like when we think about the seasons that we live in right now, sometimes for like winter, that retreat, that rest, that's actually like a little bit more of that feminine, that energy essentially being brought forward in its traits and its elements versus like the spring and the summer. Yes, there is because we're playing, we're outside, but we're also doing so much more. So
Right.
there's that masculine too, setting up the structures of the vacations and everything like that.
Yeah. Um, so one of the questions that I often get from clients around intuition, especially when people are sort of starting their journey of listening more, is just really, the basics. Like, what even is my intuition? How do I know if my intuition is speaking versus something like fear or some other voice?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, absolutely. It's so unique and it's so different for each individual. And I always come back into like leveraging the greatest resource that we have of our body being that instrument of like, yes, there's like external things that we can maybe seek validation within to see if like it feels aligned or trusting our intuition in that decision. But very much like if you're familiar with the sway test of like letting your body go back and forth and seeing like when I say a yes, do I like sway forward or do I sway back? And then when I say no, am I going to sway again forward or back just to kind of get that again coherence and calibration within yourself to start to recognize. But the biggest thing when we're talking about like ways of which intuition can come forward is there's an element of like our clairs. So you may be familiar, of course, of like your claircognizance, your clairaudience, the clairsentience. Like that one's the most profound for me, which is all about feeling. You just have this utter feeling within yourself. That's claircognizance, but like feeling as like on the temperature on the external side of your body of like I just feel chills or I just know this to be true. So I love clairsentience and claircognizance because claircognizance is such a deep knowing. Like when I always think about relationships, like sometimes you're going in a relationship and you may just have like this all of a sudden the silent voice that comes in to say, I actually just don't know if I'm doing this because I want a partner or if this is like the actual partner that I want to be with. And then months go on and then you may break up. And you always just kind of knew that something wasn't right about that relationship, but that was your intuition already guiding you to begin with. It was just more of like that fear or the comfort of having someone that you chose to say yes. So there's just little different attributes of like starting to bear witness. And when I first started to really lean in and understand what is the Claire that was most prominent for me, really just asking myself each and every day, like creation energy, my intuition, come forward in this meditation in the way that's best guided for me to receive. Is that when I ask a question, do I feel it? Do I feel it in my body of that knowing? Or maybe I hear it and that clairaudience and the clair even like the visualization that comes forward too of just like you have such a great sight of being able to see too. So I'll leave it there and happy to dive into that deeper, but it's such a grand question in the sense of
Yeah.
depending on how already attuned an individual is to their intuition, they would know. But I would say really make the ask to work with it and to be shown how you can work with it greater too.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, no, this is definitely where I wanted to head with it. Yeah, I think there's that journey of, in the early stages is just maybe you don't have to know the distinctions or even believe. I didn't actually believe in, I was very afraid. I call it spiritual fear,
Yeah, yeah.
spiritual gifts, essentially.
Mhm.
And label them any of those things. And, when I first started, I mean, you have them your whole life and sometimes they cannot feel like gifts.
Right. For some.
So I think that's the journey too, is like sometimes you're so sensitive to them, or perhaps you
Mhm.
develop them as I know you're very trauma informed. And I also observe that you can develop your spiritual gifts at a young age because you are overcompensating for something happening with your like parent,
Yeah.
dynamic. So that's kind of an interesting aspect too, where, you know, it can, in a lot of ways, these are survival skills. They're beautiful
Mhm.
survival skills, right?
Absolutely. And, like, I've seen it so often too of, like, even I'll never forget a client who actually had their mom take them to get their third eye closed, like, to a spiritual
Mhm.
place, and, like, really just because for many families too, it was like they didn't want their children obviously connecting with the unseen or communicating with spirit in that sense. And so, very much like you said, whether it was like the child kind of tapping in as an escape survival mechanism or being told like you have these gifts, but almost now afraid to use them in a way too, while also how is it from a cultural perspective even perceived that you have the ability to tap in, right? So there's definitely a lot of unraveling sometimes for each individual to bear
Right.
witness there too of now how can I really tap or like know that it's still within me. I just kind of like tucked it deep away and it feels safe enough to start to explore that.
Right. Yeah. And that definitely is an invitation that I would say to listeners is find people in spaces where, especially if a particular I'll give an example of one of mine. I'm a physical empath. And so
Mm,
um I feel people's ailments. I can, like, it's not all the time or anything.
yeah.
And different things that I'll feel about other people and get confused, when I wasn't developed in my spiritual gifts, between what was mine and what was somebody else's, right?
Mm,
So
mhm.
I think the journey of caring enough to develop these things often because we need to know who we are and have distinctions and boundaries, between other people, and respect them in that way, right? Because
Yeah,
we're doing that subconsciously sometimes, right?
exactly. Yeah, that's beautiful, especially on the empathic side, like and that's kinda like what you were saying earlier too, like, is it a gift at times? Because people without necessarily having the right protection around them, they can be so exhausted in the exertion of just the unconscious energy that they are giving and holding for others, so with the I know, like, within my own journey with Reiki, and I'm grateful to see it with many others, but that almost thrusted me in a sense to develop my intuition because when you start holding space in like, as that practitioner, and you're just in that energy, your channel is open, there are these beautiful elements that, like, tap in, and it's no expectation from any Reiki practitioner that you need to give intuitive messages. But it just so happened that I would start to get these messages, and that was part of that trust building element where I would share it with clients afterwards if they were open to receive and just allow them and myself just to kind of witness there. Like, okay, this is actually like my own inner validation that this is true.
Hmm. Yeah,
Mhm.
I was going to mention that too. I think because of the fear and the distrust, as developing your intuition and working with how you work, your unique way. I think doing experiments and then like seeing, having that validation of some kind of understanding, like how you work, is a beautiful loop. Um,
Mhm.
to be able to understand like how, like, for example, another example of me is I have a very open head.
Yeah.
Um, so I can get a lot of messages. They aren't all correct, right?
Yeah. Especially that's like with that open, I know with human design to really see in our elements, like where are we open? And it is like, what is mine? And what is actually true for me? I think even more so in that discernment for you.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So let's deepen a little with how intuition and creativity um, kind of go together. Give me an example of how you've kind of done it a different way in terms of the old way that you mentioned and doing things because the externals told you to, and how have you listened
Mhm.
to intuition and your creative impulse?
Yeah, there's been a few ways. Most like when I think about your audience too, when I think about creativity, it's equally been in like the copywriting sometimes of a program, of letting that just intuitively come to me through channeling ultimately, like in meditation and just like opening up my voice notes, setting that intention and saying, this is what I want this program to look like. This is what is going to unfold, but not necessarily having like when we think about those structures of, okay, I'm going to sit down, bring in the logical mind, bring in the mind of like, you need to have so many points hit. Like when I really think about true copywriting, my channeled copy may not hit those points, but it's so intuitive and it's so true for me that I just allow it. And same goes for like when I go to launch in my business. There is a point in period of like I would try to rationalize around maybe I should launch in like May because of X, Y, and Z. But in my body, it wanted to be expressed now. And so I would almost see parts of that like duality come up too of like self-sabotage, of that mind saying, back to like parts of these structures and conditions of you need a period of this amount of time to launch. And it's not to say that's not true, but also acknowledging what was in my heart. And when I come from my heart, and when we're talking about creativity, when I can really tap into like what gives me bliss, what gives me joy, what really, it's not just like leaning in and making decisions on excitement, but making decisions that are very rooted into how I desire to hold the space and what I desire to create. So into like creative arts, that can also just be genuine like movement with the body. And how do I choose to like I go back and sometimes to like I'm very organized. So sometimes I'll have like block times on my calendar that have a specific workout. And I'll feel that resistance already approaching with that workout. And I'll just go back to myself to say, but what does my body actually need today? If I were to skip more of like this hit kind of workout, maybe I just do a nice Pilates or I just go for a walk without any guilt or shame with that and just allow it to be. And that's
Mm.
part of, I feel, intuition in the creative process because when we really start to allow ourselves to open and be in flow and surrender, that's also where we receive more and we can be guided to witness more miracles in a way too, where it's not so controlled and confined into how we envision it or need it to be.
Yeah, lots of little pieces there. So I'm hearing you say really, in a lot of ways, creativity is the moment to moment ability to adapt, essentially, to what's
Hmm.
present.
Yeah, I love that interpretation of it because essentially in a different way of saying it, that's exactly it. Of like, can I be adaptable? Can I be adaptable? And like the other word that's coming up is agile in that sense. To be okay to maybe pivot in this direction that I didn't see coming or make this turn in a way and just really surrender in that case and detach. This is part of intuition I feel like has been my biggest lesson is like trusting in letting the emotions be what they need to be and I can feel them for what they want to be, but also detaching from a specific outcome and trusting myself through that process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, this is interesting distinctions because I'm feeling like, if somebody's listening and they're going, okay, I want to trust my intuition more. I want like the step-by-step guide, which would
Yeah.
be kind of ironic. But
The irony in it all, right? Like it's
but like I empathize with that, initial stage essentially.
Mhm.
And I think maybe there's a lot of mixed messaging out there. And what I'm kind of gleaning from some of what you're sharing is you you said something about like stability. So it's not like we're not suggesting you just like drop everything and like, change everything every minute all day long, right? Like there's still that balance here. And there's like these commitments that you have to your life and your structures and the like containers and everything within the context of what you've said yes to before.
Yeah.
But that there's like the initial nudge, the initial spark almost that feels really tied to a creative spark, right? Like
Mhm.
the way that you would feel that can be very like I don't know what that feels like for an individual, right?
Exactly. And that's part of like that journey too for them, for wherever they may be, of like maybe it does start with meditation if they're not even like meditating, even 5 minutes a day, and just starting to lean in. Or maybe it's just actually being present with nature. Like nature is such a guide for me in delivering messages, being a mirror. But sometimes we'll go for a walk and we'll be plugged in, listening to a podcast, listening to an audible, and really just actually allowing yourself to witness and observe and just start those little inklings. Like even for me, animals are so intuitive of actual animals out in the wild. Like if I see one, I really respond to that of like this was brought forward for me as a message today. But I had to really bring in some curiosity as to like what does it want me to receive from this message here. Um but I really think like even there is a point of like I think about creatives like obviously with your podcast and everything too of like maybe it's even you've had this nudge to go buy watercolors or you've had a nudge to go buy a coloring book or just even like a hula hoop. Like the spectrum's so wild, but like follow that nudge. And so often within our intuition, it's really about also our inner child. And I feel like these aspects of like, let's bring in this play, let's have this opportunity because when we're in those moments, we're creating that space to receive. We're not in that whole, again, the logical, rational mind. We're very much within our bodies. So that's very much where we can receive.
I love that. Yeah, one of the things that I had to remember from, being stuck in my adulting was nonsense. Like, what even is nonsense and why do I care about it? Because I sure loved it when I was young. Right?
Yes. Yeah. It's all these little ways of which it can communicate or just like bring us back to ourselves because that's part of very much when I reflect upon like that connection back in 2016 and where I've become and who I've grown into be. It really has felt like this homecoming journey. And that's really been part of intuition of like a homecoming, coming back to ourselves in ways of which, like you were even saying, like with the nonsense, like, why did you care so much? Or like, why did it matter? So little things like that of reconnecting with that childlike essence, but it's always been within us. We've just put it aside for a little bit
Yeah.
because
The
of
way you're talking too, it sounds like it becomes your way of life almost, like the lens through which you kind of operate, right? Essentially.
mhm, mhm, very much. And I really, really, this is why in my service offerings, like Reiki has been such a piece that stayed with me because of the catalyst that it offered and extended in my growth. And just recognizing even today, there's there's other like elements moving forward in my day, and I'll send symbols, which yes, it's intuitive, but it's also the energetic magic within our intuition that we can open ourselves up to of like sending that symbol with the intention of what it holds into events and knowing that I can be then held and supported in a force that I can't necessarily see, but I can deeply believe is there to ensure that the outcome is exactly how I desire it to be.
Mhm. Beautiful.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I know you tell me a little bit more. You had mentioned you went on your business journey from one direction to another. How did your intuition help you guide you?
Mm. That's a great question because I was a little bit at odds, I would say, with my intuition at that time. And this is how sneaky, like I'm equally being like a mindset coach. Like the mind always baffles me, but how
Mhm.
sneaky our thoughts can be. And there was a point last year. So I went through essentially what I call a little bit of like a grief journey as well through this process in this whole new identity, and having received some further certifications in my journey and really just starting to feel, when we're talking about intuition, I do want to just like rewind it a bit of like January last year. I got a message that said, when I'm in polyvagal informed, so being polyvagal in that course, immediately that first month, I got this message and I told my mom that I need to bring this into corporate environments. This work and this application needs to be shared and needs to be held in this arena. So that was January 2023. It wasn't until October that I actually made the the outward commitment to it. And it's just so funny when I reflect back, because I knew in January, and I just chose not to listen. And by not listening, it's not to say that things were horrible from January to October, but this is really where I was having that battle, because I was so attached to what I knew to be safe. And this is really where, when we're talking about the fear, the mind, I was attached to something that, for one, was very, very comfortable, that I knew the process in and out, that I knew how to get my clients the results, and everything in between. So, of course, it was just like a crutch almost. And I was actually in a Reiki healing myself around like August and September. And that's really where it just kind of came into my body to be like, would I hold on to like even a relationship at this point in time if I knew I had outgrown it? And it was almost just to see it in the light, even of corporate. Like, when we're entrepreneurs, we don't get tapped on the shoulder to say you're promoted, but we need to promote ourselves. And that was really a point in a juncture for me to acknowledge it's safe for me to, one, step into the unknown, but it's also okay for me to let go and evolve. And I maintained aspects that felt incongruent and still do feel incongruent to my beliefs and my time within that business. But that's really where I brought forward new messaging. I made the pivot, and I chose to trust that I can expand with creation through this. And yes, there are going to be the ebbs, like with any sort of new foundations that we're laying. But it has been so beautiful, so enriching, so fascinating to jump into this direction. And I just laughed though, because I had to go on that journey myself to say I knew in January it had to happen. It just took me the whole year to get myself there and somatically embody it too.
Yeah, that's the piece that stood out from your story, is to me is just like that's what it took, right? Like once your body is ready for something, it's so much easier to do, you know.
Yeah,
There's not
completely.
missing.
It's, and these are like those tools and those exercises, and like our ability to really prepare our physiology to hold that space, to be that person, is so critical, because this is almost like the counterintuitive element of like being that mindset coach, but not necessarily having the nervous system on board, the body on board through a lot of the creation with clients. So it would only take you so far, because then again, like you were saying too, like we need our body there,
Yeah.
and it just is such a protection piece for us, of course, just knowing how our nervous system works. So yeah, that was part of the journey for me.
Well, and you're
And
at the edge of creation as an entrepreneur, right? And so I think what you're talking about is a very experimental space. It's very
mm,
amazing to be able to kind of find that. Like sometimes the body's going to be ahead. I've had that happen where I, like, oh, okay, body, I get it now. That thing you were talking about a week ago.
right. And that's almost like, for that's where we find that like the self-efficacy and the evidence too, of like, yes, like you told me this, I remember feeling it, I recognize you here, and how you were communicating with me.
Yeah,
I love that.
it's fascinating. And then, yeah, and like you mentioned, sometimes we'll do a behavior before the thing that's connected with it comes in later, you know. That throws my mind likes to put together the linear. It still really does like to do storytelling.
I get that too, where it's sometimes like it's almost like I play a game a little bit with it because it's just so fascinating to me sometimes, like how pieces are connected or how people will come into my world and we don't see it. But like maybe I started something new and then on a new platform and I would never have met this person if I didn't trust to go on that platform and so on and so forth, right? Like the snowball effect that comes from it. So yeah, it is like you beautifully kind of said earlier of like the whole journey itself has now been enriched and enwrapped in like allowing my intuition to lead me and guide me. And I think that even comes with like when we're looking at mentors too, of like not only who do I feel connected with, but letting your body respond. Like, do you feel that expansion? Maybe there's some contraction with it. Really just kind of assessing how do you feel versus the mind again of like maybe one mentor cost this amount and you'd rather go with this one because they cost this amount, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing. All right. So, and before we wrap up, I would just love to hear what are the fun things that you're offering to the world right now that you want to share around?
I appreciate that. Well, on the topic of intuition, Reiki, and I am still holding space for online Reiki certifications. That's within Asui Holy Fire 3. So from level 1 to mastery. But in this side of my new direction with my business, I will say I do hold space for one-to-one clients. I work a lot with executive leaders and founders to design employee cultures that are very rooted in well-being through neurofitness solutions. So I also do a lot of workshops and training, speaking engagements within masterminds to really bring this element of how quickly and impactful regulating our nervous system can create a heightened level of performance, engagement, communication, productivity, you name it. So that would be part of the services right now that I'm extending outside of course, the beautiful element with Reiki.
Yeah, I can see why you were led that direction. I have an extensive corporate background, and thank you and bless you for bringing that to corporate. It's all about, I mean, that's really what corporate needs is to become more sensitive and human.
1,000%. And the human centric approach, like this has kind of been that screaming point of coming from HR and seeing not only the client side, but the external stakeholder side and being in unions. It's just been so gleaming in that sense to have this full circle last year come about. And of course, there was that resistance to say, do I want to go back into corporate? But now I'm consulting, I'm coaching, I'm delivering in this element. So thank you for acknowledging that in your words.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This was beautiful. I appreciate you being on today.
Thank you for having me and can't wait to witness the journey that your audience goes on and tapping into their intuition further.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
I need to figure out a better way to wrap up.